Tēnā koutou. Welcome everyone to our regular monthly event of the Wellington Socialist Society. We've got another history one for you. This is a little bit of a different format to what we've had in the past. We're doing a panel this time with three authors who have, in the last several years, produced biographies of figures in New Zealand political and trade union history who have been important. So just a little bit of housekeeping stuff. Bathrooms at the back for one, if you haven't been here before. The bar, well, that's obvious. We have a sign-up sheet, or possibly several that are floating around if you're not a member and you want to be, or even if you just want to be on the mailing list. Is that a thing? Can you be on the mailing list without being a member? Yeah. Right, I should know these things. You can sign up there just to stay in the loop with what we're up to. You can also, of course, find us on social media. We have a little bin there on the bar where if you, it's obviously voluntary, if you feel so inclined, you can make a small donation to our cause. We're also selling our little magazine or journal, depending on your perspective, the Commonweal. This is, I think, it's the fourth issue, and it's a pretty good one, in my opinion. It's starting to gain a bit more momentum in the magazine. There's actually a fair bit on Labour history in this one, so some of the themes that will be discussed tonight you can read about more in Commonweal. That's edited by Martin in Christchurch, and people can kind of contribute to that from around the country. I think that about covers it, Angus. Yeah. As far as the Socialists say, I mean, our whole purpose is educational, essentially. So that's hopefully what some of you will you'll get something out of the chats tonight. Is you might learn about someone or some series of events you didn't know about before. So we've got three esteemed historians here. And I'm just going to give you a brief rundown. There's more information on their careers on the event page, but I'll just give you a kind of précis. So on the end here we have David Grant. He's been a professional historian since '91, following careers in journalism and secondary school teaching. He's authored 14 books, including 3 biographies. So the one he's going to be talking about tonight is his recent biography of Jim Anderton. And David's also been involved in the Labour History Project, which I'm involved in as well, and he's been involved in the Collective Media Trust. We've got... sorry?
Community Media Trust. Yeah, no, that's my mistake.
Oh, Community Media Trust, thank you, Russell. Yeah. We've got in the middle here Peter Clayworth. So he's been a professional historian since 1999. He's come from Nelson originally, and he's worked for a number of government departments. He's currently working for the Office of Māori Crown Relations, and he's also been involved. Yep. And he's also been involved in the Labour History Project since 2006, and has done a lot of work on the commemoration of the 1913 Great Strike. He's currently working on a biography of Pat Hickey. Can you tell us when that's going to be published?
Got to send a manuscript to Otago University Press at the start of next year, and then they'll tell me whether they'll publish it, and if they don't, I'll be sending it to somebody else.
I'm sure it'll come out. Peter's a good historian, he's a good writer, so it's an inevitability.
I really hope so.
Finally, we've got Rebecca McPhee. She's an award-winning journalist. She's worked for or written for a huge number of publications, which I'm not going to list all of them here, but publications like New Zealand Listener, National Business Review, North and South. She's the author of fantastic kind of, well, I think it's sort of blend of journalism and labour history, which is the tragedy at Pike River Mine, how and why 29 men died, and that's been updated and reprinted every year since it was published in 2013. And she's also the author of this book on Helen Kelly, who was the first female lead of the New Zealand Trade Union movement as the head of the Council of Trade Unions, and that's what she's going to be talking about tonight. So We're going to have about 10 to 15 minutes from each of our panellists, and the first of which will be aided by PowerPoint. And we're going to go chronologically, so it's not in terms of importance of each of their respective subjects, just chronologically in time. So Peter's going to start talking about Pat Hickey, we're going to have David talking about Jim Anderton, and finally Rebecca talking about Helen Kelly. So Peter.
Okay, stand up. First, I need to know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and I'll also point out this could be a bit odd because I'm going to have to turn around, see where my slides are at. And I may need to consult the notes if I forget something. I'm hoping that I won't need to. Okay, Patrick Hodgins Hickey, 1882 to 1930. Next slide. Pat was born in, I can't see the, doesn't look like the bits underneath the pictures are coming up, but it's the Wangapeka Junction, which is still the back beyond even now. That's where the Motueka and Wangapeka rivers come together near my hometown of Nelson. So he's born there in 1882 into a big Irish Catholic family. At that stage, his family are hacking down the native bush to make a farm out of the middle of nowhere. He's born into a family, he's the third son and fourth child in what ends up being a 7-kid Irish Catholic family. His dad gets killed when Pat is 8 in a tree felling accident. There we go, that's cool. Okay, next, this is the one you want. So Foxhill, they move there, and their mum moves them there. They have a small farm in Foxhill, which is on the railway line, and there are small villages around there, which you can still see to this day. So he's in a situation where he is hard up but not broke. He is renowned at school for being a really good fighter and not being afraid of anything. He's also quite a bright bugger, and he just misses out on a scholarship to get into secondary school. He can't afford to go to secondary school, so he leaves school at the age of 13, which in those days was a year longer than you had to be there. Next slide. So his father claimed that the family had this great property waiting for them in Ireland, and Pat at this stage has no great interest in unions or socialism, but wants to go to Ireland to get this property for the family. So he ends up in California because he thinks that he'll be able to get to Ireland cheaper from there, and there'll be heaps of work. He finds there is heaps of work, but it's incredibly badly paid. So he becomes a hobo riding the trains. And the thing is that while New Zealand at that time is under Seddon's Liberal government, and it's the land without strikes, and there's all these laws about employment and so on, where Western United States is open slather, naked capitalism. He sees strikes, he sees graveyards full of people killed in mining accidents, he works in unsafe conditions, he's a hobo in the winter when it's freezing cold, and he's having to deal with the violence of railway guards and all kinds of things. He's not, still at this point, interested in unions, but the one point interesting from the point of view of class struggle is he could get work in these rough conditions if he chose to scab, but he will not scab, neither will the comrades who are also non-unionists that he's travelling with. So, at the end of that, next slide. Other way, sorry. So, what he gets from this work also, he starts working in smelters, and he starts working in mines. And this is very important for his later union history. Next slide. Yeah, so he's led into this life of mining, has to learn all the skills and all that, but that's very important for the later career. And the next slide. So back to New Zealand, broke and disillusioned with the United States, still not particularly interested in socialism, some quite racist attitudes, which are very common among the white workers of that time. But he goes to Denniston, and there he does I don't know if you're familiar with Denniston, but the mine up on the hill and up north of Westport. There he does join the union, but he has no interest in the union. He just joins it because you have to, because it's a closed shop. And he's really just interested in having a good time. But he does get enough money together, and move on to the next slide, to be able to book a trip on the ship to the UK and get to Ireland to finally find the great treasure that's waiting from the pot of gold. Next one. So he gets to County Cavan, where his father came from, meets up with the relatives, thinks Ireland is the dirtiest, poorest country he's ever seen. He has no romanticism about it at all, even though he's been brought up in a very Irish background, but learns that the property is a complete myth. His father was a penniless orphan, and so what's he going to do with his life? But he seems to have had a rethink about the United States and decides now that he knows he's got relatives in New York to go there. So he does that classic Irish thing of crossing the water and going to the east coast of America. And we'll go for the next one. So, gets to New York, there's strikes everywhere in New York. Once again, America is a land of class struggle. So he won't take a job where there's strikes on. He goes up to Youngstown, Ohio, the steel mill, meets there people who are in the Homestead Strike of the 1890s, which is a incredibly violent strike where Carnegie's people shot a whole bunch of workers. From there he heads on to Colorado. Next picture. This is from 10 years later, but when he was there was another one of the strike, what they call the mine wars going on. He literally sees armed militia with bayonets guarding the mines there during the series of very violent strikes, which involved shootouts between the bosses and the workers. He then goes once more to Northern California, meets up with a mate of his from his earlier travels, and they go to Washington, as in Seattle, con a company into a ranching company, and that they are ranch experts, and get hired to go and next slide, to go and sail around the Aleutian Islands looking for cattle sites, which they actually know nothing about at all, but they're using this as a con to try and do some prospecting themselves. They don't find anything, but it does show what a mad bugger he was, because they're sailing around this place off the coast of Alaska in an open boat, and he doesn't even have any real boating experience, although his mate apparently did. Next slide. So 1905, he's in Bingham Canyon, and this is where it gets interesting on the class struggle side, because he joins the union there, the Western Federation of Miners, WFM, the very people who've been involved in that warfare with the bosses in Colorado. He meets veterans of those strikes. He joins WFM. He also, next slide. There you go, that's the WFM book. Part of the membership book, their whole idea is revolutionary industrial unionism. All wealth is made by the workers. There's the idea of class struggle as the basis of everything. He adopts this as a philosophy. He also joins, next slide, the Socialist Party of America. And he becomes, after being a devout Roman Catholic, a rationalist. So it essentially sets him up for his political beliefs from there on. Same time, next slide, the WFM are involved in setting up the industrial workers of the world. So he's familiar with all that going on at the same time. And from that he goes up to Northern California, does a bit more mining and that, and then comes back to New Zealand, all fired up with these ideas, and goes back to Denniston. But, next slide. And Denniston is under, like the rest of New Zealand, or rest of unionised New Zealand, under the compulsory arbitration system. The land without strikes is known. You're supposed to settle your disputes through the arbitration court. Pat thinks this is a complete sellout. He wants class struggle, direct action, all this kind of thing. And he puts this to the union. They're not interested. This time, but what's happening right then is that, so Seddon has died, the charismatic leader of the Liberals. Joe Ward, the new Prime Minister, doesn't have the same amount of charisma. And a lot of workers, not necessarily majority, but a lot of workers getting disillusioned with the compulsory arbitration system because they think it is not meeting their demands anymore or meeting their needs anymore. And a lot of those militants are in the mining movement. Quite a few of them are coming over from Australia where they've been involved in really full-on strikes there. One of those Australians he gets together with in Denniston, that's Paddy Webb. Next slide. Paddy is second on the right among the seated group there. So that he and he and Webb set up a branch of the Socialist Party in Denniston. A lot of the young folks there are very interested in this, they get involved. They do a lot of stirring both at the workplace and in the town. Pat gets the sack, heads south and ends up at Runanga. There, and what have we got next? Yep. Can probably move on to the next slide. So Runanga, he gets together with Bob Semple, another one of these Australian miner activists, and they go around push bikes, setting up little branches of the Socialist Party in the Grey Valley, in the little mining communities. And then Paddy Webb comes down, joins up with them along with his mate George Hunter, another Victorian miner. Pat gets the sack from Runanga. There's a bit of a pattern going on here. The three, Hickey, Webb and Hunter, decide to go to Blackball, where they know they can get work, but also they're keen on stirring things up. They get to Blackball, found another branch of the Socialist Party. A lot of the young folks there are interested in the union there, wants them involved, and they take on one of the issues that are going, particularly this one of that the miners have a quarter-hour crib, that's a quarter-hour lunch. They want a half-hour, and they vote for that. Pat becomes the poster boy because he's the one that the boss goes, get back to work. If you don't do this, you're disobeying the mine manager's instruction and you can be arrested. Pat comes out with this legendary revolutionary line in reply to this, but look here, Bocco, I haven't finished my pie yet. So he's arrested. Then a few days later, 7 guys are sacked, being Pat, Paddy Webb, George Hunter and 4 other guys, all of whom are on the executive of the Blackball Socialist Party. Walter Rogers, who's the secretary of the union there, he backs these guys fully, and they get the miners out on strike, which is illegal under the arbitration acts of the time. This becomes a big cause celeb, gets a lot of newspaper coverage, especially over the clash in the arbitration court later on, but the miners win. And from this, they come up, it helps to build the next stage, which will be a whole lot of the unions, mining unions start looking at setting up a big federation to take on the bosses and the government. And the next slide. Oh, no, back. We need to go back. Back again, there. That's the one. So, Bob Semple, Pat Hickey, they're the 2 guys that do a lot of the organising, and this is them right about that time, young fellas all full of piss and vinegar, running out there, really enthusiastic, and they succeed in helping get together to form this big federation that can take on the employers, and a lot of the folks involved with it are into the idea of direct action. This eventually leads to a broader union movement, the Federation of Labour, New Zealand Federation of Labour, that brings in all these other unions, and eventually it gets the nickname of the Red Feds. Now, next slide. The other big event in Pat's life from Blackball, which is even more significant, is he gets together with Rose Rogers, the daughter of the union secretary, who is herself, she's a local school teacher and a staunch socialist. So they become a couple, and that's a big backup because you got 2 people together with similar ideals fighting for a similar cause. Next slide. So 1909, 1910, Pat's at Runanga. He is now, he's given up on the idea of actually working in the mines and basically goes on the idea of being a union organiser. And he is working as the organiser of the local labourers union, which also becomes part of the Miners' Federation, even though they're not technically miners. And this movement keeps building, next slide, until 1911 he gets married, Rose and Pat get married at Greymouth, they move up to Wellington, and Pat takes up a job working on the Maori Land Worker, which is a paper that the miners essentially stole from the Shearers Union, took from Christchurch and brought up to Wellington, and it becomes, as you see from the byline, a journal of industrial unionism, socialism and politics. Industrial unionism being the idea that all unions should be not based around craft but around each individual industry to be able to take on the bosses in each industry. So Pat's now with Moradan Worker, doing organisational stuff for the Federation and also helping campaign against compulsory military training, which has been brought in. Next slide. Then 1911, he stands as Socialist Party candidate for Ahini Muri, the electorate that also happens to include Waihi with the Waihi Miners. Essentially, the Waihi Miners Union and the Federation asked him to be their candidate, and he's not that convinced. His central beliefs are in revolutionary industrial unionism and political action, but at this stage he's way more into the union direct action. He's a bit dubious about politics at this stage, but he thinks there's a great propaganda opportunity. So he does that. He doesn't win the election, but he does feel happy with it because he has got a lot of socialist propaganda out. Next slide. You won't be able to read this particularly, but at least we forget. There's one of the articles there. This is the thing that made him super notorious. This article is when he put out his ideas that if workers' first duty is to their class, if they have made an agreement with the bosses that says they can't go on strike, they should throw away that agreement if it means they can't back up their fellow workers. The final part of the article says, if we can't do this, then workers should be prepared to toss every agreement to hell. Hickey becomes known as to hell with agreements Hickey, and this phrase is used against the militant unions for years afterwards, like right into the 1920s, and both the bosses, the employers, and the moderate unions all use this phrase, and Hickey himself stands by his statement right through. He always says, nah, this is the right way to do it. Even though he becomes much more moderate later on, he never backs down on that particular phrase. But it is a very important part of the story. Next slide. So, with the struggle that's going on, all these unions are joining the Feds, pulling out of the arbitration system, going for direct action, quite successful for a while, but then there's this thing where groups of small unions are being set up with the support of the bosses, going into the arbitration system and pulling people back into it. This happens at Waihi with the breakaway union, the engine drivers, the Waihi miners all go on strike against this, saying they won't work with the scab union as they see it. This becomes one of the most bitter strikes in New Zealand history. Pat is strongly in support of the Waihi miners. He's sent by the Federation to Australia, travels around for about 5 months, raising funds from the Australians. There's also, by the way, another strike in Anangahua going on at the same time, a lockout due to opposition to use of a dangerous drill. So Pat's raising money for a strike fund for both those disputes, and in the end, mostly the Australian miners' unions, they contribute 1/5 of the funds to what's a really big strike fund. That was Pat's job with that. But the strike in Waihi is crushed. Frederick Evans is killed by policemen. The striking miners are driven out of the town by blackleg thugs who are backed by the police. And this throws the militant union movement into crisis, especially because most of the moderate unions had opposed the strike. But, next slide, the whole issue means that the entire union movement is thrown into crisis, and Pat is involved in a movement to bring the moderate and militant unions together. They have a series of big conferences, and in mid-1913, a new, even bigger federation is established, the United Federation of Labour, which is still called the Red Feds by its opponents. Pat is appointed secretary of this group. Next slide. And while this is going on, Rose gives birth to Pat Jr. This is also very important for any person having a child, even though I've never had one myself, but I gather it is very important. Pat, one of the things you've always got to remember about him, very dedicated family man. So as soon as he gets married and then has a child, that colours all his planning and what he's doing professionally and politically ever afterwards, because he's always thinking, how can I provide for my family? He's got that attitude going on as well. You know, it's not just about the big politics, it's about what's going on in that life as well. They named child Pat not after Pat Hickey, but after Paddy Webb, who got elected as the Social Democratic Party, which in those days was a militant socialist party. He got elected as the MB for Grey just about the time Pat Jr. was born, so that's where the name comes from. That's just a bit of an aside. Anyway, next slide. The big Great Strike of 1913 breaks out through incidents in Huntly and Wellington waterfront. Really the big struggle was about who would control workplaces. The strike results in extreme violence in Wellington. Massey's Cossacks mounted special constables charged the streets. People were shooting each other with revolvers in Buckle Street and down in the waterfront. Several people were wounded. The fact that no one got killed is just good luck, not good management. And in Auckland there was a general strike for 2 weeks in support of the biggest, the widest strike. The strikes of waterfront workers and miners all over the country. On Westport and Greymouth, the miners come down from the hills and take over the towns, which leads the employers to blockade Westport and Greymouth and not allow any food in by sea. So you've got a huge strike going on, but the strikers are crushed, and through one side effect of that is that the Federation of Labour largely collapses and Pat loses his job. So he goes into a period in the wilderness, essentially, where he cannot get a job because he's on the blacklist. He ends up in 1915 working on a government labouring force building roads in the King Country. He's also really pissed off because, and so is Rose, because they're both strongly anti-militarist, not necessarily pacifist, but anti-militarist. So they strongly oppose the war, which breaks out in 1940. A lot of their comrades, who are supposedly militant unionists and anti-militarists, a lot of them actually support the war. So there's this real disillusionment over all that as well. So now, next slide. So end of 1915, Pat Jr., they go to Australia on the theory that they have much better chance of getting work there, because there's various Labour governments and things going on over there. And Pat is afraid that he could get conscripted, because they haven't brought in conscription yet in New Zealand, but it's totally in line to happen. So they go to Oz. There eventually he gets a job as a union organiser with the Victorian Railways Union, and he and Rose both get strongly involved in the campaign against conscription. Australia, unlike New Zealand where they just bring in conscription, in Australia they have 2 referendums about whether to bring in conscription. The militant unions there are strongly opposed to it. Pat and Rose are both very involved in the anti-conscription campaigns, and both referendums reject conscription. Next slide. So after working for the Victorian Railways Union for quite a while, 1919, 1920, Pat goes to Queensland with the family, works as organiser of the Queensland Railways Union and sets up their newspaper, The Militant. Clashes strongly with the Labour government of Queensland, which is the employer of the railways people there, and the railways minister puts him on his shit list and won't talk to him or anything. Next slide. Then 1920, Pat comes back to New Zealand, getting various Labour journalist jobs, gets involved with the unions again, but not with the same sort of standing or publicity he used to have. Ends up as editor of the Maritime Worker, which he eventually quits because he feels that the Labour movement is exploiting him, and he won't put up with being exploited by any employer, even the board of the Maritime Worker. But before that happens, he runs for Mayor of Wellington, fails to get it as the Labour Party candidate, and gets prosecuted for sedition for publishing an Irish nationalist pamphlet. Eventually goes to Auckland. Then in 1925 election stands in Invercargill as MP for the Labour Party there to try and keep his old opponent Sir Joseph Ward out, but fails miserably. The Labour Party doesn't do very well in the 25 election. Pat's disillusioned with what's happening in New Zealand. He, Rose and Pat Jr. go back to Australia, back to Victoria, run some pubs for a while, keep a low profile. 1929 he comes back into the political scene, about to stand for the state seat of Dandenong, a winnable seat for once, and then he gets industrial injury in the pub, gets hit on the head by a tractor when he's going down to the cellar. Then he develops a brain tumour, has to withdraw from the political campaign. gets hospitalised, goes into a coma, and then just a couple of weeks after his 48th birthday in January 1930, he dies. And that, in a nutshell, is the Pat Hickey story. So you probably, if you want to get a much better and more interesting version, get the book when it comes out. Otherwise, that's it.
Thanks, Peter. It's exciting to, I think I remember editing some of your Pat Hickey articles many years ago in the Labour History Project Bulletin, so it's great to see your book finally coming to fruition. All right, so we've now got David here speaking to his recent book about Jim Anderton.
Sure. Unlike Peter, I don't have a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to talk with my voice and my hands. Okay. There were 4 distinct periods in Jim Anderton's political life. I'm going to mention these 4. I'm going to focus most of my energies on the first 2 because I think they're the most dramatic. Firstly was his activity from 1964 when as a young man, aged 26, he joined the Labour Party organisation for the first time. The organisation was floundering. Along with Helen Clark, Margaret Wilson and others, he led the charge to grow it from then on, in particular during his stint as the party's president from 1979 to 1984. He was the most outspoken party president the Labour Party's ever had. He was highly accessible, hard-working, energetic, and possessed charm and charisma in big doses. He was also extremely self-confident. He traversed the country, hundreds of meetings, LEC, electorate meetings, trades councils. He even diffused parochial conflicts in electorates and wrote ghost speeches for the less articulate MPs. He set up hundreds of fundraising schemes, raffles, lotteries and pledge systems to vote for Labour system. As a consequence, the party organisation grew much stronger. It was more decentralised, delegates had more power. He appointed a women's officer, an education officer and set up a new paper called the New Nation. In 1975, when Rowling was Prime Minister, there were 15,000 members of the Labour Party. By the 1981 election, there were 80,000 and 190,000 more affiliates. The membership saw Jim as their new champion. I must mention that he could not do this without the generosity of his brother Brian, with whom he worked managing Anderton Holdings in Auckland, a light engineering business. Jim was the marketing manager. Brian was very generous in allowing time off for Jim to do the party work and even employed the largely Pacifica workforce to also work for the party. Jim worked at Anderton Holdings from 1971 until 1984 when he first entered Parliament as MP for Sydenham. The second section is what I call the maverick years, when as an MP he becomes increasingly into conflict with the new government's right-wing swerve as it pursued a Freedman Knight economic agenda led by Roger Douglas. He was already offside with the emerging neoliberals in the Labour Party cabinet: Douglas, Michael Bassett, Richard Prebble, Trevor DeClean, Mike Moore. But for example, in 1st of July in 1980, Douglas put forward an alternative monetarist budget proposal. Jim and Bill Rowling were aghast, and Rowling sacked Douglas as his finance spokesperson. Anderton's primary concern for the next 3 years was to try to save Bill Rowling as leader of the Labour Party. But it was difficult, but he was falling behind in the opinion polls behind Robert Muldoon. And there's a change happening slowly at first and then with increasing momentum. For example, in November 1979, David Longy became the deputy leader of the party, defeating Bob Tizard in the vote. In December of 1980, there was a plot from the neoliberals to replace Rowling with Longy. Rowling and Anderton were enraged. Rowling called them nakedly ambitious has-beens. Jim led the opposition to the potential coup, charging around buttonholing Labour MPs. Rowling survived, but only just 19 votes to 18. The plotters were apoplectic when it found that it was a turncoat, or a Wellington, who changed his mind, having pressure put on him by Anderton. His role in this contest was revolutionary. Never before had a Labour Party president played such an overt role in preventing an insurgency in the party's leadership. The end of 1982, Rowling resigned. He had no choice. The polls were swinging against him, and the Labour Party felt they need to be revitalised. Longy became the new leader of the party. But in the party itself, Anderton was still very popular. For example, in the 1983 conference, he defeated an MP, Peter Tapsell, who had the approval of the NewLabour for the presidency of the party by 978 votes to 259. He would become a popular local candidate right from his political life from 1984 to 2011, as it transpired under 4 different political parties: Labour, NewLabour, the Alliance and the Progressive. The last name essentially his own party, but tied up with Helen Clark's Labour government. The electorate Sydenham firstly, and then Wigram remained his political bedrock. And it's important to remember right through this story. He had replaced the wayward John Kirk in Sydenham as its MP. He revitalised the electorate organisations, much as he had done for the party. The beginning of the end, and my argument, began on the 3rd of May 1985, when the Timaru MP, Basil Arthur, died suddenly. Basil was close to Jim. They worked together. They had a by-election. The Labour Party appointed Jan Walker, a Liberal lawyer from Hamilton. The National appointed Maurice McTeague, a local farmer who had stood in the 1984 election. Basil Arthur had won this seat with comfortable majorities for the last 3 elections, and there was no reason why he wasn't going to win it again, according to the Labour Party positivity. But he got off. But he lost. But Labour lost. Why? The election was expanded. The government had already removed farmer subsidies and industrial subsidies. Inflation was still high at 15%. McTeague won by 2,500 votes. Jim was enraged. He was angry. He was blaming the Labour Party policies as the neoliberals were starting to gain more influence in the Labour Party cabinet. He went public with it. He splashed. He talked to the media about it, so it was splashed in the newspapers. This time he was offside with his friends like Helen Clark, Margaret Palm. Others MPs also did not want. They wanted unity in the party. They wanted to last for a long time. This was soon after the 84 election. They wanted to be there for a long time. The split with Helen Clark was a contentious one, and it happened right through to the 1996 first MMP election. In the period between 1987 and 1890, the monetarist view of the party intensified. 2 things, dramatic things happened. Firstly was Douglas's flat tax proposal. Everybody was going to pay the same amount of tax no matter what they earned. Horrendous. Secondly, and this affected Anderton more, was the desire of Roger Douglas and the others to start an asset sale process. They wanted to sell what they said were poor performing state assets to the private sector. Therefore, by September of 1988, the Coal Corporation, the Government Printing Office, the Development Finance Corporation, New Zealand Steel, and Petrocorp were all sold. Were they poor performing, as the 1987 Labour Party document suggests? No, they were not poor performing, some of them. The GPO, for example, had made continuous profits for years. Then, carrying on with this process, and against the wishes of most New Zealanders in opinion polls, Air New Zealand, the Bank of New Zealand, Forestry Corporation, the Shipping Corporation, Postbank and Telecom were also privatised or set up for privatisation. This was much more than was mentioned in the 1987 policy document. Anderton, a traditional Labour Party politician, was now doubting his own sanity. This is not the Labour Party that he joined way back in the 1960s. He was aware, of course, of Labour's Constitution Rule 242, which effectively said that all government MPs must support their party's legislative intent. But on the 29th of July 1988, during the second reading of a Finance Bill number 3, which proposed the sale of the BNZ and Postbank, he reneged. It had an operating profit of 182 million in 1988, 22% up on the previous year. He refused to return to Parliament for the final vote for the sale of the BNZ. He was suspended from the party, but he won his case on constitutional grounds with the help of Andrew Ledley, who was a constitutional lawyer and became a close friend. But by now he was listening to more tales of woe in his electorate office. The poor, the unemployed, the elderly, the mentally ill. Jim understood that he owed them his loyalty. These stories were now getting worse. They couldn't afford power cuts, rent bills, food price increases, unemployment increases, growth and unemployment. He could no longer make excuses to these people who came in droves to his electorate office to sustain, but the party is doing this. Because he disagreed, obviously, with what was going on. The focus was very different. In April of 1989, feeling betrayed and already having survived an attempt to expel him on constitutional grounds, as I mentioned, he quit the party in protest. It was dramatic. But it was not rash. He was told by an economist that the government would need to find nearly $1 billion to reach his target benefit. Also, political scientists told him that there was no chance that Labour would win the 1990 election. So, he quit. The third aspect of Jim Anderton's political life was when he set up the alternative to what had become a very alien party for him. He set up NewLabour soon after he was kicked out of Labour, and later, soon after he left Labour, and later the alliance parties. Notably, 12 of his 13 electorate staff in Sydenham went with him. They resigned from the Labour Party and joined him in NewLabour. For a period in the early to mid-1990s, the alliance was more popular than Labour, or National, and he was the most preferred Prime Minister in the opinion polls. When MMP arrived in 1996, 13 Alliance MPs were elected to Parliament. Give an example of how popular he was, or how popular the Alliance became. In August, early in 1994, Ruth Richardson, who you know, the mother of all budgets, which promoted the rich and penalised the poor, she resigned in a huff, so there was a by-election in the Selwyn electorate. Standing was David Carter for the National Party, John Wright for the Alliance, he was the leader of the Democrats, who had been coming behind him, and Marion Hoggs for Labour, and also Tim Shadbolt for New Zealand First, which I can't really understand. But Wright for the Alliance came within 500 votes out of 15,000 of winning that seat, only a few hundred votes behind David Carter. Marianne Hobbs was more than 5,000 votes behind that. That's how it nearly resisted in essentially a rural electorate. It was remarkable. His fourth stint is when he became a conventional politician, when he became a highly regarded and hard-working Minister of the Crown in the Labour Alliance, and then later the Labour Progressive Coalition governments from 1999 to 2008. During the first 3 years of that, it also saw the implosion of the Alliance Party, which is more than just an add-on to this. Many in the Alliance membership were more left than Jim became. They saw him as promoting more Labour Party politics because he was the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, than being an advocate for Alliance. This is not really true, and the best example of that was his desire and wish and success in establishing Kiwi Bank. That was his policy. It wasn't Labour Party policy. They were opposed to it initially, and certainly the Nats and all the others on the right were opposed to doing this on cost. Okay, that was the Kiwi Bank. So Kiwi Bank became a success story. Jim fought very, very hard to get that going against multitude opposition. It took quite a long time. That's all I'm going to say. I'm up to my 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour, so I'm going to finish there. Thank you.
Thanks, David. All right, Rebecca. Helen Kelly.
Helen Kelly. I dare say there's a few people in this room that knew Helen. Maybe sparred with her from time to time, possibly got organised by her, or cajoled by her, or bossed around a little bit by her, possibly got elbowed aside by her at some point, or found yourself recruited into some kind of important task that you didn't know hitherto before being thus organised. But I dare say there's also a few of you here who knew the other Helen, who were loved by her, supported by her, empowered by her, mentored by her, activated by her drive and energy, and quite possibly struggled to keep up with the flood of ideas, plans, creativity and incredible energy that she possessed. I knew Helen for about 3 years before she died, and I'm a journalist, she was a union leader, so initially it was that kind of relationship, but more than that, I would call it a friendship, and that's really entirely because of one of Helen's extraordinary gifts, which is her openness. She made friends easily, and she valued those friendships, she nurtured them, and she was intensely loyal to them. She had an incredible memory for the ordinary detail of daily life. And she, I remember personally one time mentioning something to her in my family life that was worrying me. I can't even remember what it was. Months later she asked me about this, remembered why I had been stressed. I don't think I could remember it myself, but this was classic Helen really. And this was at a time when she was busy organising the families of dozens of forestry workers killed at work, driving a judicial review of the decision to let Peter Whittle walk away from court charges over the catastrophe at Pike River, fighting the key government's anti-worker measures such as 90-day trials, and generally trying to modernise the union movement. But I mentioned Helen's talent for friendship because I do think it was a gift, and it was fundamental to her skill as a leader, fundamental to the leader that she became and who we saw by the time she died far too young in 2016. And I have to say personally, there are not too many days when I don't have pause to think about how we're missing her voice these days in this funny little country of ours with its opportunists and fantasists who would rather polarise and blame than build and grow, and with its struggle to honestly face its crises and chart a decent, dignified future for all. But Helen's life, one of the reasons why I chose to write her book is that I could see that she herself was a a lens on our modern history as a country. She was born in 1964, a late baby boomer. Her parents were Kath and Pat Kelly. Pat was born into savage poverty on the Liverpool docks, came to New Zealand as a 10-pound com in 1954, became a union organiser, joined the Communist Party and married a fellow traveller, Kath Eitelbaum. Kath was a middle-class, privately schooled Wellingtonian. Her whakapapa included Jewish entrepreneurs and colonial judges and lawyers. Kath was a progressive who became a communist while travelling in Europe and living in London in the years after the war. And so throughout Helen and her older brother Max's life, Pat and Kath were activists and organisers. In 1970, when Helen was 6, her parents were expelled from their party, along with most others from the Wellington branch of the party. As Kath said in later years, by then the party, the Communist Party, was led by what she called drunks with very strong opinions. In her view, the party had left them rather than the other way around. Pat was an organiser with the Wellington Drivers Union, regarded as a militant union. Then he took over the moribund Cleaners Union, Wellington Cleaners Union, when Helen was in her teens. So she grew up among strikes, long strikes, amongst planning and plotting and organising and phone calls and delegates coming and going from the house in Mount Vic. Kath, meanwhile, poured her energy into CARP, campaign against rising prices. There's been reference to CARP in some of the recent commentary about the current inflation crisis. Kath recruited Helen and Max as child organisers, sticking up posters and spying at Woolworths on unlawful price rises. So Helen and Max ate every night at the tea table amid debate about protest, action, pickets, organising, politics, apartheid in South Africa, the dictatorship in Chile, the war in Vietnam. They were marinated in it. In 1984, Helen turned 20. That year, her friend, Max's friend, and Pat's dear friend, Ernie Abbott, was murdered in a violent attack on the Wellington Trades Hall. She was studying to be a teacher at the time, and I think the grief never really left her, nor her understanding that that act of terror had been enabled and fed by the persistent anti-union narrative of Robert Muldoon. It was a devastating lesson in how and why words matter. And also in '84, of course, Helen, Kath and Pat, who by then had switched their loyalties from the moribund Communist Party to the Labour Party, were part of the effort to help Labour beat Muldoon, not knowing, of course, what was to come. By May 1991, Helen had left teaching and was working full-time in the union movement. It was something of an inevitable move for her. She was with the early childhood unions, essential workers who were underpaid, undervalued and marginalised, but whose movement had a rich heritage of activism and struggle for recognition and decent paying conditions. And they were getting somewhere. Early childhood workers had only just got their first national award a few years before Helen joined. It was a massive step forward for women, for children, for quality early childhood education, and for the dignity of this work. In May '91, that was shattered by the Employment Contracts Act. And as you all know, of course, the moment when 100 years of industrial conciliation and arbitration system of wage bargaining was smashed and replaced with the purest of pure market models in which workers were deemed to have equal power with their corporate employers or their small employers equals in the act of bargaining, and were now free to negotiate their wages and conditions as individuals. During the first 2 desperate years after the Employment Contracts Act, unemployment reached 11.2%, and at the same time the mother of all budgets slashed benefits and enforced for some a punitive 6-month stand down for the dole. Ruth Richardson's austerity was supposed to trigger an enterprise culture, as she called it, in New Zealand, and said, of course, as David has alluded to, it triggered a steep increase in inequality, poverty, and for the first time food banks became an essential part of our social infrastructure and economic infrastructure in New Zealand. So Helen's style of unionism was burnished through these years of collapse, these years of the near implosion of the union movement, and the years of gloating and celebration by business leaders who had got the industrial relations and social environment that they had demanded, and I might add, had organised very successfully to achieve. Helen's experience through the 1980s was not perhaps as bleak, however, as Pat's, who saw his own beloved service workers' union almost brought to its knees. And he retired at 63 to save redundancy being inflicted on some of the younger organisers. Helen went on to the NZEI, one of the few parts of the movement where significant gains were achieved in the 1990s, notably pay parity for primary teachers. Helen was intensely involved in the second phase of that, in which that principle of parity was entrenched. She was also a central player in delivering pay parity for kindergarten teachers in the early 2000s when Labour returned to power. When I started working on Helen's biography in 2018, lots of people told me how she was a blend of Pat and Kath. Pat's warmth and humour and pragmatism, Kath's fierce intellect and discipline. I think this was true, but it also minimised her. She was Helen Kelly, a leader of workers in the modern era, battling to shift the narrative in which workers were supposed to be grateful to have a job even if it killed them or didn't pay them enough to put bread on the table, in which workers should genuflect to employers who were kind enough to pay them a wage, and never complain and feel lucky to have a job for any pay. This was the era that brought us the Hobbit dispute in Pike River. Both exemplified the country we had become in the years when Helen was honing her organising and analytical skills, one in which a kind of madness could consume this capital city, with hordes out on the streets, attacking and threatening actors for wanting decent conditions from one of Hollywood's richest productions, one in which an underground coal mine could be built by people without the competence to manage it, nor adequate understanding of its catastrophic risks, but which no one would stop. Not the disempowered regulator, not the disempowered union, not the directors who had convinced lawmakers that they were capable of self-regulation. A coal mine whose path to catastrophe would be unimpeded and at liberty to stumble along until it blew up and killed 29 workers. This was Helen's context as a modern Labour leader. I remember going through a period when I was working on the book when I thought that her experience of the Hobbit madness, followed just a few weeks later by Pike, had radicalised her, had made her develop into the leader that we saw by 2016. In the end, I realised that wasn't really true. She already had the insight and analysis. She'd seen those forces through her life, albeit in different political contexts. She had sped across town from Teachers College on her scooter in March 1984 to discover that the terrorist of Trade Hall had killed Ernie and not, as she had feared immediately, Pat. She'd helped on cleaners' pickets during Muldoon's wage freeze. She'd rallied against the bill in 1991. As Secretary of the Association of University Staff in the 2000s, she'd tried and failed to get multi-employer sector bargaining from highly paid university CEOs who lorded it over scholars and lecturers and gardeners and administrators. I think what happened, though, in 2010 with the Hobbit and Pike is that she was galvanised. I think she was shocked at how the country she knew as a child growing up in Shannon Street in Mount Victoria had become so compliant, had become such a client of unbridled corporate interests, and how even when the consequences were revealed to be utterly catastrophic, was still incapable of resistance against this. Helen was the first woman to lead the union movement when she was elected to be the president of the CTU in 2007. No one here really understood it until a year or so later, but by then the global financial system was in meltdown. And then a year later, 2008, the key government was elected, and it responded to the GFC with a kind of soft shoe austerity. By this time, unionism had become a kind of a privilege available only to those who were in big sites where unions had been able to maintain a strong organising presence over the previous 2+ decades, and particularly so in the state sector. But if you were, as Helen used to say, a four-square worker in Kaitaia, there was nothing. No one was coming to organise your shop. If you tried to organise it yourself, you'd probably get the sack. There was no national document putting a minimum under all grocery workers' wages that would have captured you as the lone four-square worker in Kaitaia. So if you were this worker in Kaitaia, or Bluff, or wherever, the best that could happen is every now and again you might pluck up the courage to ask very politely for a little more money, and maybe or maybe not you would get it. Helen's ambition was to establish a new system of union and bargaining structures that would serve the four-square worker and the drivers and the cleaners and the warehouse workers and childcare workers and security guards and others for whom the ECA, the Employment Contracts Act, had eliminated representation and bargaining rights. Among other efforts to modernise the union movement, she wrote, or modernise the bargaining framework really, she wrote a 200-page draft bill establishing industry standard agreements. This was in 2011. That was the precursor and analytical backbone of fair pay agreements, which finally passed into law last year, and which will soon be repealed before a single such agreement is reached. Helen was determined that the union movement was for workers, whether or not they were union members. And so she battled for years for the dignity of a young security guard, Charanpreet Dhaliwal, murdered alone on a dark Filtram Hogan building site in West Auckland in 2011. She was so determined that the union movement had to be a movement for Charanpreet and those like him that she was willing to lose a CTU affiliate, an enraged CTU affiliate, who walked out because they didn't get the principle that she was chasing. And then there were the forestry workers dying violent deaths on steep, cold, wet logging sites without recognition, without enforcement or accountability. Helen used to say that they were cheap deaths. For this work, she was accused, interestingly, by the forestry industry of grandstanding and exploiting the family's grief. And she fought for those workers by organising their families. And none of them, neither Charanpreet nor any of these dead loggers, were union members, of course. They were workers, and in Helen's view, the movement needed to stand for them. She had incredible energy and stamina. She was full of ideas. They just poured from her. Some of them were bad. Some of them possibly expended precious energy that a small and under-resourced union movement could scarcely afford to waste. But I think all of them came from a wellspring of conviction that the status quo was untenable. She said in a speech in the winter of 2012, and I'm quoting here, "It can't be the deal that when you work Monday to Friday or longer and spend it can't be the deal that you can work Monday to Friday or longer and spend Saturday at the food bank. Work has to make a greater social and economic contribution than that. It's not a deal that anyone I know has signed up to. It's crept up with the deregulation of the labour market in the 1990s, and in particular the treatment of employment as simply a commercial transaction. It's the workers' version of leaky buildings without the outrage." I think key to Helen's strategy was to try and restore the outrage. She ran towards the bullets. She recruited Anna Osborne and Sonia Rockhouse to sue the state for letting Pike's boss get out of a prosecution by paying money that was already owed to the Pike families. She took forestry companies that had killed workers to court and won, in defiance of a complacent state regulator that had failed to enforce the law that was supposed to protect workers. She understood the power of words to shape minds and frame politics. She was constantly attacking the dominant narrative, as she used to call it. She gave voice to injustice and indignity in a country that had forgotten how to notice. And she was also a rarity, I think, in that as she became more influential, particularly in those years from about 2011 through to 2016, she also became more radical, not less. And had she lived, she would have been part of the 6th Labour government. And I'll leave you with just that last thought, really. Just imagine the difference that might have made. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Rebecca, and thanks to Peter and David as well. It's been a really interesting kind of sweep of Aotearoa political, economic history over the last 100 and so years. All right, we're going to take a break for maybe 5 minutes, and people can get some refreshments, go to the bathroom, etc. I think we'll just have a very brief Q&A tonight, just in the interest of time, because we've gone on a little bit more. It's my fault, not the fault of our speakers. Yeah, we'll just have several questions, and then people can head home. We can head home now if you like, but yeah, I'll leave that up to you.
1:45.
Okay, hello everyone. We're just going to settle in again we'll keep it brief because I'm mindful that we're in fact nearly 8 o'clock. So I think we'll just maybe have a couple of questions if there are any. Yeah, the floor is yours. If anyone's got any questions. Am I going to have to ask the questions?
Kick us off, moderator.
All right, well, I'm going to ask one then, and then hopefully someone can come up with at least one question in the meantime. One thing, this is really more for Rebecca and for David, because these are the two main works that I've read. One thing that I felt reading both these books is that Anderton and Helen Kelly, while they had, I suppose from my perspective, pretty solid politics, they were also human beings, and they were pretty complicated. And I think that came through well in both of these books, that they were pretty complicated people. I think Anderton in particular had a very, very egotistical side to him. Helen Kelly perhaps not quite so much, but she could be pretty tough on people as well. So I just thought there was a kind of an interesting thing, whether you could comment a little bit more on the place of these sorts of personalities in politics. They're sort of putting forward a very humanistic vision, it's supposed to be kind of creating a freer, more caring society, etc. But at times, personally, it could be very tough on people around them, probably on themselves as well. Yeah, that's my kind of question.
You want to see you go through.
Yeah, Jim was autocratic by nature, and he didn't suffer fools gladly, so he'd even berate not only the right-wingers that he came into contact with, but also some within his own party, particularly the Alliance Party. The Alliance Party consisted of NewLabour, the Democrats, Mana Mutahaki, the Liberals, and most importantly the Greens. That he got offside with a number of the leaders of those particular groups. It was always a tenuous organisation really, because they all had different political philosophies in essence. The value of the alliance was to have some kind of solidarity, but that was sometimes hard. And Jim was actually quite egotistical towards particularly members of the other strong personalities, particularly with the Greens, with Jeanette Fitzsimons, who was distinct there. And there was a lot of angst during the period of the implosion of the Alliance Party between him and Matt McCartan, who had been a very close work and president of the Alliance right through the 1990s. They both clashed, and it was never resolved. So, what Kieran said is true. On the other hand, probably having that kind of personality was essential to get those things going, get the alliance going, get the alliance doing well in the 93 election, not so much in the 1996, and by the 1999 election the Greens had left over that conflict, and that was part of Jim's personality, that he didn't accept the differences in philosophy between those two parties. So, yeah, that's true. Rebecca?
Yeah, I don't see Helen as an egotistical person. She was bloody tough, and she was an extrovert, an incredibly extroverted person, and had enormous stamina and productivity, incredibly hardworking. And I'm sure this is true of anybody like this, including Jim, I'm sure. Also, the capacity for work of people who are driving for change is something to behold, really, I think this is possibly true of Jim as well. There's a couple of words that I have a private ambition to reclaim from the corporate sector, one of which is innovation and the other of which is productivity, because they're big, powerful words and they belong to all of us, but they've been kind of privatised. But Helen was both of those, and she was trialling constantly. I mean, this combination of sort of extroversion, determination, quick to judgment. Yes, she would, like, I've met and interviewed people who still had the bruises on the ribs from being, the weirdo. She was genuinely, I think possibly that it's a different personality type to what we're talking about with Jim fundamentally. I had a huge access to Helen's papers. They had not been filtered in any way at all, so I had absolute confidence that I saw who she was. And she had this incredible capacity for both hardness and kindness, and she'd be in the middle of organising, dead forestry workers' memorials or whatever, and she'd be in Auckland sorting out her uncle and aunties moving into a rest home. I mean, in the middle of it all, she'd be dealing at this kind of incredibly personal level of compassion and care, and at the political level, driving for these sort of big structural, narrative, systematic shifts that she thought were necessary. She didn't really. She was Labour tribally, but she didn't really. She didn't speak in ideological terms. She fundamentally, I think, reclaimed the language of fairness and equity. And I think she had that capacity, and that's a sort of this personal capacity of. That's why I mentioned the capacity for friendship. Her incredible openness of character was enabled her to be somebody for this country in a period when it had hardened to these issues. And I think wasn't just sort of an idle observation on my part. I think it was materially important to her style of leadership. And I, one of the things that was important for me was to see that in fact that was true. I, saw it with my own eyes and, gazillions of correspondence and interactions, unfiltered. So I was able to feel completely comfortable and that she was the person that I'd come to understand. Hell of a cost though, what a cost. And it's more that question, I think, for me, that what it takes from somebody, and I see this with activists now, other people who I know, what it takes to try and bring about these deep-rooted change and what it extracts from people. I don't know what the answer is, except that we have to kind of keep, this kind of thing, communicating and telling stories and remaining sort of committed to a better country that we're capable of being. That doesn't answer your question remotely, probably.
It's very interesting. Can I just plug it? Of course, Pat Hickey is a lot harder to work these things out because it's not something you see on TV. You haven't met him in real life, etc., etc. So you've got a lot less stuff to go on. But my impression that I've got is that some of them a different thing again. You got a guy who was full of energy. It makes, that wouldn't happen otherwise, and therefore incredibly hard working. He had a reputation for being a bit of a wild card, but I think a lot of that was the fact that he had these really very set ideas about a lot of things, and therefore he could really piss people off, because he would, especially with fellow unionists, really attack those who he sort of not being radical enough or whatever, but I get the impression it wasn't a personal thing, but they often took it personally. So he could piss people off a lot. He had the ability to, he was good at these things of organising these big groups. When it got into federations, when it got into the nuts and bolts of going on, he did not create groups around him. He didn't become part of any sort of faction, which is pretty partly because he kept pissing people off, but also because he stuck with what he thought. But he did create intense loyalty among the small group of people who were his close friends and associates. So he never really became one of these guys who had the big power within any of the groups he's involved with. But yeah, definitely those folks are not necessarily easy to be with all the time, and it's pretty hard to know with him just the details of it, but he definitely did piss off a lot of his old friends at various times, but that's sort of partly due to he thought he knew what he was right about and would stick with that, but it wasn't up to the question.
Check.
A couple of questions. First of all, David, I wonder if you have anything to say about the split of the Alliance Party over the war in Afghanistan, Jim Anderton's role in that, and what we might come to think about that in, I guess, hindsight. And for Rebecca, I was interested, you mentioned in passing Helen Kelly had many good ideas and some bad ideas. I wonder if you could take a moment just to talk about what those might be.
Yeah, the war in Afghanistan was really the key issue that could not be resolved between Jim Anderton and his followers, which included roughly half of the Alliance MPs there in Parliament, and the other half. Helen Clark was asked to send troops to Afghanistan by the Americans. The Alliance Party said, no, we're not going to do that. It's the only way that we would ever send troops to Afghanistan if it was a request from the United Nations. And that was a dilemma that was never resolved between the two groups. So that was the main thing. There were other issues as well, like genetic modification, and that was also never resolved. The Afghanistan thing, Matt Robson, who was Jim's offsider through those 3 years, wrote a big report and tried to explain to the Alliance Party the reasons why they should follow the Helen Clark decision, or the Labour government decision to send troops there. But it fell on the flat ears. And Matt McCartan, who was also as autocratic at times as Jim Anderton was having not a bar of it. And it became quite personal between those two. They worked very closely together, right from the formation of NewLabour right through to the end. But after that, they never spoke again. It was a complete turnaround in attitudes towards what was going on internationally, particularly through that decision of government sending troops to Afghanistan at the behest of the American government.
A bad idea. I'll talk about one that I personally don't think was a bad idea, but other people did, or some other people did, and it's an idea that didn't work. So one of the things that Helen came up with in this, incredibly fundamental challenge for the union movement was how to come out of its kind of the idea of unions being a club for card-carrying members, who, if you're a member, then you can have a personal grievance taken on your behalf, or you can do some stuff because you have rights as a member, versus the forced group from Aotearoa. So she came up with a notion called Together, which was a union for all comers, basically, a low-cost, virtually zero-cost entry for everybody, or you might be a family member. Or she wanted it to work for the forestry workers, who she'd started to effectively organise via the deaths of so many of these workers. How could this turn into, how could you channel this as an organising mechanism? So Together was this idea of this kind of rubbing out the line between union membership and unionism. Sort of big U unionism and little u. So unionism is the notion of a movement for those who sell their labour to live by, and those who are part of what had become a privileged group, effectively. I think the reason I say there were critics who are still around today, maybe there's some in this room, who think it was a stupid idea. I don't think it was a stupid idea. I think it was classic Helen. I've got this idea, I've developed it, we're going to do this, kind of recruiting people to roll it out. It was a website, it was this platform that was in the digital era. It just didn't work. It still exists, actually, but it's really a digital kind of campaigning platform now. It's not a membership. It's not an organising platform for sort of outside of specific causes. So it took quite a lot of energy. I personally think it was the kind of trial that needed to be happening at that time. And I mean, Helen had inherited this sort of peak body in really good shape after several years under Ross Wilson and Peter Conway's leadership. So she didn't have to kind of spend a lot of energy, just kind of fixing the basics. She inherited an organisation that was in really good order, that had been doing a lot of innovative and good organising work. But the problem was, and it remains now, this kind of state of stuckness of 70, 80, 90% penetration of the union movement in the workforce, and below 10% in the private sector. So I mean, in some ways you can look at it that her heritage was a continuation of Ross and Peter's, but with kind of more pace, more stuff going on, more really out there stuff like organising the forestry workers was big. I think it's it's fundamentally part of the process of sort of rebirthing a sort of an organic labour movement, and that it didn't have an end point. It didn't have a point where that worked, we made this change, or we reached this breakthrough. That didn't happen. But that's where we're at. That's where we're at in this economy. Where somehow, in amongst all of this mess, the means have to be found to enable and empower people to have some rights again, and to have some equity and opportunity again, whether they're part of an organisation like a union or not. So yeah, that's a kind of muddy answer, but I mentioned that as bad ideas because there was a lot of tension, as you can imagine, within. Helen had a winning way though. She by and large would bring people round, but all of them were sort of probably arguable points when you're an incredibly sort of small movement and under-resourced and underpowered. Where do you put your resources?
Okay, well, I think given that it's past 8 o'clock, we'll end this part of the evening there. But I'd just like to say again, thanks to our guests. Rebecca's come up from Christchurch as well, Peter and David are Wellington-based. A special thanks to Rebecca for making the trip for us. It's been a really interesting evening, and it's the first time we've done, I think, a panel on history stuff. So that's the first. So yeah, just a round of applause. I've also got some gifts to distribute just as a small token of our appreciation. Also got an issue of latest issue of Commonweal, which I mean you can use it as kindling if you want to.
Thank you.
Thanks again.